Hello and welcome to another live inspirational common unity collaboration show. My name is Markabadi. It is a pleasure to be here with you. It is Feel It Friday. It is the Friday to feel. And we've had a fantastic week of collaborative community sharing their insights. And today is no exception. We have the phenomenal and wonderful Daniel Paul Nelson, son of Danny Sheehan and Sarah Nelson, of the Romero Institute and Lakota People's Law Project. He's going to be sharing on social and environmental justice in changing times. Daniel is the director of the Lakota People's Law Project and the deputy director of the Romero Institute. The Romero Institute is a non-profit law and policy center that confronts systemic injustice. Its flagship project is the Lakota People's Law Project, which Daniel leads as director. He oversees all Romero Institute departments and helps to decide strategic directions for the organization. He spent 15 years he has over 15 years of experience as the deputy director, working with a nonprofit. He holds a BA in political theory from Harvard and an MA in social science from Chicago. He's also a very good musician, very accomplished, and has a great range. I've always been impressed by his range. You can find more at romeroinstitute.org or Lakota People's Law or on social media. So without further ado, let's go over to Daniel Paul Nelson. Daniel,
how's it going, Mark? Hey, man.
Hey.
Am I on? Am I live?
You are on and live.
Right.
The camera seems now pointing up. Tilt it down a little bit so we get more of you.
Like this?
Exactly.
There we go.
Exactly. More body and less air. How are you? How's things?
I'm good, brother, and it's good to be on with you, man. It's been quite a while since we spent a lot of time together, focusing on things we both care about. So it's a pleasure.
Indeed. It's always great to have you on. And tell me what's going on for you in your life with your work, and how's these times been for you?
Yep. Well, I want to start, if you don't mind, just by mentioning to your audience that you and I have an illustrious past. We've done some amazing projects together that I'll never forget. We started out.
Try.
What's that?
As much
as we might try. We had an auspicious encounter initially in LA, where you and I had both moved to town. This was about 4 years ago, I think, and we had both kind of come in from other spots and decided that we were going to make our mark and contribute to the community in that area of the world. This was in Venice Beach. We both came into the organization called Full Circle, which is a sacred space and an event center down there in Venice. An extraordinary kind of concatenation of different personalities at the time. The gentleman Andrew Keegan, who's a former child actor and fairly well-known guy in the kind of new age and spiritual community, was running that space, and you and I got to kind of operate there for a while together. I was the operations manager, and you were, I guess, an event producer. You came in and produced events for us at the time. And then from there, somehow you ended up helping to produce Bhakti Fest, one of the preeminent yoga festivals in the world. And then you absorbed me into that project as I left Full Circle. And that was just an extraordinary serendipitous experience to be able to work with you for, I think, 5 months in the summer of 2015 to produce Bhakti Fest down in Joshua Tree. Taught me most of what I know about the yoga culture. I mean, I've always appreciated and loved yoga as a philosophy and as a practice, but I got my hands on it in a much more intimate way. And I mean, look, it's just life-changing to be able to spend periods of time innovating, experimenting the way that we did during that year, bro. So it was just a real privilege, and I want your audience to know that we had all that work together. Oh, last thing to mention, of course, is that after Bhakti Fest, you and I both came to Santa Cruz together and worked at the Romero Institute, which is the nonprofit that my parents founded many years ago. I guess I can segue now into that topic.
Great segue.
Yeah. So Santa Cruz is an amazing town, of course. I don't know how many of your listeners are based here, but it's an extraordinary small town, kind of like the little sibling of the Bay Area. I like to think of Santa Cruz as like San Francisco's little sibling. It has all the consciousness and awareness of the Bay Area, but it's a beach town with a lot more intimacy and quietude. So we have this organization here called the Romero Institute. It is the predecessor of this organization is the Christic Institute. It's possible that some of your listeners are aware that during the 1980s, the Christic Institute existed in Washington, D.C. It was a nonprofit law firm as well, dedicated to social justice, and it conducted some of the largest cases, civil cases, of the past 40 years. I mean, the Iran-Contra scandal, for example, in 1986, I think, is when that lawsuit was filed. The Christic Institute targeted 29 different defendants who had been involved in conducting the Iran-Contra. It became a scandal. Initially, it was simply a crime, and it was tied to the Reagan administration. Just a very, very quick loss. I mean, they were basically illicitly selling tow missiles to Iran and skimming money and sending it down to Nicaragua to fund the paramilitary anti-socialist movement there called the Contras. And there was drug running involved because drugs were also being used to fund this guerrilla movement down there. Anyway, it was all part of the war against communism, which obviously is a painful chapter in American and global history. Of course, it's still ongoing. Bernie Sanders, in my opinion, should be the current Democratic candidate for president, but he's not on the Democratic side, probably because he's considered socialist. Anyhow, that's the legacy of the work that I currently do. The Romero Institute is now the successor organization to the Christic Institute, and we're based here in Santa Cruz. We basically we're committed to environmental work, Mark. I should mention also for your listeners here that when you came and joined me, which I continue to be grateful for, it was an amazing collaboration. I thought about 7 months we spent working here in Santa Cruz. You actually were the individual who discovered the Monterey Bay Community Power Project, which was an effort on the part of Santa Cruz elected officials to create what's called a community choice energy program here in Santa Cruz. It, I think, is probably was the 7th or 8th community choice program created in the state of California. In essence, it's, it is a legal category whereby municipalities can create their own utility companies, nonprofits, operated by the elected officials themselves. So in this case, we replaced Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E, as the kind of default utility for this area, and created our own nonprofit that now has a governing board, and it's producing cheaper, cleaner energy for this tri-county area. And the work that you and I did together, of course, was we created an effort, a successful effort, ultimately, to increase the size of that program. We ultimately doubled the size of the program by bringing in the counties of Monterey and San Benito. It would have just been a Santa Cruz County project. And so now I can very proudly say that every time I get in my car, I've got an electric car. Every time I get in my car, I drive around, I don't produce any carbon whatsoever. All the electricity in this entire region is carbon free. We're not contributing to greenhouse gas emissions and to climate change in this area every time we use electricity. So you and I did that work for 7 months. It was very, very grassroots. I remember you coming back one day to the office and saying that you had discovered this very interesting thing going on. And we were very quickly absorbed into it as an organization. At that time, we'd actually gotten a grant, and we were probing and looking for how we wanted to make our mark with respect to climate change. And, it was just felt very, almost like it was preordained to me that we were going to end up doing that particular work, and it lasted about a year. So that's it, Mark, that's an example of the kind of work that Romero Institute continues to do here in town.
Right. And it's not just in town, obviously it's global.
Yes.
Your dad is a human rights lawyer, and this is where it started from. He's relatively famous, Danny Sheehan. Now, he's got a different name from you, which I always enjoyed, because your mum is Nelson and your dad is Sheehan, so they kept their names, and then they gave each of the kids one of the names, right?
That's right.
Does it ever feel like you're happy to have the Nelson rather than the Sheehan? Do you ever kind of think about swapping it back?
No, I don't think about it too much. It's what I like about what my parents did is they gave their first son, I'm the oldest, my mother's last name. And I think at the time they had no intention of having a second child. They did ultimately have a second son, my brother Dagan. who I love very dearly. But no, it was the era of experimentation, and the feminist movement was strong at the time, and I think they decided that they were going to pass along my mom's name.
Great, great. So, to the point, how do you, because there's lots of environmental and social justice. The other big project that you're involved in fact, you're the director of, is the Lakota People's Law Project.
Yeah.
That was birthed out of, can you explain what it was birthed out of briefly, and now where it's gone from there?
I sure can, Mark, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the Lakota side of our work. I mean, it's changed my life completely. I'm identified with communities in South Dakota now at an extraordinary level. It's an incredible privilege for me to spend about half my time doing community organizing on tribal nations in South Dakota. It started about 15, 16 years ago when a group of grandmothers actually from the Dakotas, this is from South Dakota. I don't know exactly what tribal nations they were from. It may have been Standing Rock. But they were traveling around the country to illuminate people about the crisis of suicides, youth suicides in particular. I think Standing Rock was second only to Japan, I think globally, for suicides in the early 2000s. And, my parents, being social justice advocates and very experienced organizers, decided that they wanted to do something about it. And so we created this initiative. At the time, it was a small initiative. And the next major development is that my father was able to recruit a very famous and well-respected NPR journalist, National Public Radio journalist. Her name is Laura Sullivan. And she came to South Dakota and conducted like a year-long investigation into what was going on with, in this case, not suicides, but foster kids, the crisis of foster kids being removed from tribal communities and placed into non-native foster care environments, which the UN, the United Nations, recognizes as a form of cultural genocide. When you have a colonizing community that has, taken possession of, for example, land, and created a colonial construct with respect to another community, in this case, Native American people here in this country, and then they continue to forcibly remove kids from that original environment, place them into settings where they become essentially deculturated. And that's it's been going on in this country for years. It happens in Australia, it happens all over the world. Indigenous communities are colonized, brutalized, and then in the years that follow, their kids are removed from them. And, things like, they've been prohibited from speaking their language at different times over the past 100 years. They've had their hair forcibly cut. They've had, of course, their religion reimagined. For example, in the Dakotas, Catholicism has been quite dominant. So all of this amounts to a type of genocide. So we focused on that issue very early on in our work, and Laura Sullivan from NPR came out and did a year-long investigation. She did a groundbreaking series of stories on NPR. I think they were heard by something around 20 million people. Basically, she did 3 days consecutively of like 30-minute stories. They only do that like once or twice a year. She won a Peabody Award for that reporting. It just broke this thing wide open. At that time, I think 6 different people in Congress demanded action from the Bureau of Indian Affairs to fix this problem, let them know what was going on. And it led to, 15 years of additional work by this organization. I will mention that we've gotten very much involved in pipeline resistance as well over the past 4 years. So whereas foster care and adoption was kind of the initial core issue that we worked on, in addition to youth suicide, which was something that we touched at the very beginning, pipeline resistance and climate change activism, defending First Amendment rights of especially Native people, but everyone, to protest against fossil fuel infrastructure. Everybody probably listening to this interview is aware that Standing Rock just exploded 3.5 years ago. And ironically, the work that I did in 2012 in South Dakota was primarily focused on Standing Rock. I actually spent 6 months living at that tribal nation, organizing a massive foster care and adoption summit in Rapid City. So I became very intimate with a lot of the leaders there. And I suddenly discovered in 2016 that a lot of my former colleagues, people that I had worked with for many months and knew very well were suddenly at the center of this Dakota Access Pipeline protest movement. For example, Phyllis Young, who I partnered with in 2012, at that time she was a tribal council member at Standing Rock. She was the official tribal liaison to the No Dapple Ocheti Sakoi camp in 2016, right at the center of that entire thing. So what we did is we sent our team out there, and I think, Mark, this was probably right after you left the organization. We deployed our team, including my dad, who you've mentioned is quite well known. He's got a lot of credibility. People know him, and we actually, very interestingly, we actually did a partnership with Agape Church down in LA. Everybody may have at least heard of that. You know about Agape, Mark. Michael Beckwith is the quite well known pastor down there at Agape Church in LA. Anyway, we partnered with them, and we were doing a sequence of live streams to the Agape community from the front lines at the camp at Standing Rock. And for example, Danny was live streaming the moment in December when the Obama administration decided that they were going to actually revoke the permitting and shut down the construction process. That, of course, got subsequently reversed by Donald Trump as soon as he took office. I think the second day that he was in office, he reversed that. But in any case, we have really taken on a lot of responsibility in the area of environmental activism out there. And I guess I'd be remiss to not mention my illustrious colleagues in Lakota country, Chase Iron Eyes, former congressional candidate from North Dakota, an amazing prophetic attorney, young man. He's about our age, you and me. Madonna Thunderhawk, she's a co-founder of our organization. She's also someone that was involved in creating the American Indian movement back in the 60s. She's the first cousin to Russell Means, who a lot of your viewers might know. Russ Means became a famous actor, but he was also a very famous activist and organizer from Pine Ridge, from the Oglala Sioux tribe. The third person to mention is Phyllis Young, who has also been very central to the American Indian movement. She came out of, I think, Minneapolis, but has been living at Standing Rock. That's where she's from. She's from Standing Rock, although she's lived in many places. And she was probably one of the two most well-recognized female leaders of the No Dapple movement, of the Dakota Access Pipeline resistance movement. The other is LaDonna Brave Bull Allard, who some of you may have seen online or what have you. She's also very well known. And I've worked a lot with her, but she's not my colleague. Phyllis Young is my colleague, and I work very closely with her. So those three Native American leaders, I actually, Mark, consider them to be, three of the most powerful, charismatic Native American leaders in the country. They have among the three of them, they have a tremendous spread of skill and experience, and working with them has been absolutely a privilege. I'll just throw out a couple examples of things that we accomplished last year. We went to DC and met with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is basically considered the creator of the Green New Deal. She didn't actually invent the concept, but she certainly has popularized it and has kind of moved that ball down the field quite a bit. We got to meet with her for an hour. We went to DC and were received in her office. During this visit, we traveled with the current president of the Oglala Sioux tribe. His name is Julian Bear Runner. He was actually at Standing Rock and got arrested alongside my colleague Chase Iron Eyes. So the two of them were very close. We went and sat with AOC, and we talked about the Keystone XL pipeline. We talked about climate change. We talked about what's needed in this country to get us from a kind of irrational, self-destructive path that we're currently on to one that's more rational. She talked about spirituality. She talked about how she actually decided to run for Congress while at Standing Rock, which is absolutely amazing. What's that?
Great. You've now been able to link your human rights, social justice with the environmental justice via the sort of Standing Rock pipelines notion. And of course, a lot of the environmental afflictions happen to groups of people who are in the minorities, who are in the lower economic status. And of course, we all know that happens to Native Americans a lot because they've got the lands, but it also happens to people of color.
Yep.
How do you decide what is the good fight to fight with regards to, how much you help the individual to how much you kind of go into the holistic big picture and look at the long-term story?
That's a very interesting question, I would say. Yeah, I mean, how much bread and butter, kind of individual support, or maybe just for small groups as compared to the broader systemic? It's a great question, man. And it just depends. It's all very organic, as you, I'm sure, recall from the work that we did together. A lot of it is just about getting your hands dirty and your feet wet. You know, you get into the mix and you try to figure out where you can be most useful. So, you know, for example, we actually ended up legally defending Chase Iron Eyes, my colleague, in court, because we do have attorneys that work with us. And it just occurred in the middle of the movement. You know, Chase ended up engaging in direct action, civil disobedience, and he got arrested, and they wanted to put him in prison for 6 years. And so we responded to the need to provide legal defense to him, and it ended up yielding a year's work, you know, doing public ed and litigation. But you raise an important point, because you have to keep your eyes on the systemic problems. You can't, for us, at least for me, the key is to provide direct support to people. So for example, we just, you know, were able to get a Native American mayoral candidate at Standing Rock returned to the ballot. He had been kicked off the ballot because of some ridiculous technicality by a nearly all white city council. That's a long story, but that's a kind of a local issue. You know, it has to do with voting rights for a very small community. About 600 people live in this town. So you have to focus on that with a percentage of your time, but you can't lose sight of the bigger picture and the need to be always strategically kind of attacking these broader systemic problems. And for us, I would say that the climate change and environmental degradation is the big strategic goal that we have. If at any point we got too far away from that, we would start to become uncomfortable. But I find that while I'm organizing in the Dakotas, I'm able to attend to lots of other issues as well. And I'll say this, if I didn't do that, if I was kind of dogmatically and rigidly committed to only the big picture, I wouldn't have the relationships and the trust that I need to be able to operate effectively. It's right. by being responsive to the immediate needs that people have, like a mayoral candidate who has been kicked off the ballot. That's how you develop the relationships that are needed to organize effectively in Indian country. Mark, last thing I'll say on the topic is that I'm sure that you have probably experienced yourself. These communities are deeply suspicious of non-native people. Indigenous communities have been mistreated so long and in so many different ways that it is very difficult to earn trust and to collaborate effectively. You know, that's no doubt true of African American communities too. If you want to be useful, we're living right now through a moment of complete and total transformation, I would say. Well, not complete and total, but radical transformation in the way that we approach policing in this country. You know, what we saw happen was a breakdown of trust. What is happening now is the illumination of the lack of trust between law enforcement personnel and African American communities. When your job is to provide a service to a group of people that has been systematically mistreated, you have to build trust first. You know, and anyway, maybe you want to talk about what's going on in the country right now. It's a big deal.
I'd be interested to know, you know, you've been working with the Native American communities for all this time, and I'd be interested to know what insight you've gained from that, because, you know, clearly you're white. You're whiter than me. And so, and you're a man. And so, you know, there is that, I'm interested to know what you've learned from the work that you do with the Native Americans and having sort of won the trust of the communities, because as you say, I've seen this kind of element of the people of color in this current revolution that's going on, these protests. They're almost saying, okay, white people, thank you, but just back off.
Right.
How do we, you know, from our hearts and from our privilege, help situations like that?
An incredibly poignant topic to consider. And to be perfectly honest, I don't have any formulas and I don't have any real answers. I just have my experience. And, you know, the first thing I'll say is that, you know, it's fragile. Any trust that exists, any opportunity to be useful that exists, it's fragile. It could go away at any moment. You know, and I haven't figured anything out. I have just been lucky for a while to be able to be useful And I will say that my willingness to walk away from the work is probably part of what makes it effective for the moment. Like my understanding that it could dissolve at any time, my willingness to basically be ejected from the communities where I work, uh, you know, maybe that's noticeable somehow. I don't know, but I do know that
Interesting.
that you have to be, you know, look, the fundamental problem, Mark. I mean, you're a meditator. You understand the problem of egotism. The fundamental problem with anything, with any social injustice, any crime, any, you know, is egotism. It's people losing sight of the humility that we're capable of as human beings. I have to constantly work on my humility, and when I do that, things seem to go pretty well. When I fail to do it, things don't go well. You know, even with, you know, aspiring to humility, even then things cannot go well. But that in and of itself is a type of humility, accepting the possibility that, you know, my utility could end at any time. So I'll mention just tangibly that I'm willing to be attacked. I'm willing to be criticized. I'm willing to be disregarded. It happens when I'm out there. There are moments when I feel completely invisible, and that's okay with me. Like, it's okay for me to be sitting at a tribal council meeting and be the least important person in the room. You know, every tribal member that showed up, no matter what their station in life, is more important than I am at a tribal council meeting, because I'm an outsider who is visiting, you know, and just, you know, basically expendable.
I think that's beautiful, Danny, the way you put that, and this ability or intention to be okay with walking away from the work at any time. It almost, you know, it reminds me of this a slightly different social situation, but when you are content and with a romantic partner and you're happy, and you've got, for example, for us, we've got girlfriends, people seem to approach you more. There seems to be like a greater attraction because you are sitting in this center of non-need, not grabby and needy. And for me, what you mentioned, it's the same sort of thing with work. If you go in from the center of no needing, like, I don't need to be the center of attention and make it all about me and make my anger the rage of the front line. How dare you police do this? It's like, I love that, what you shared. I think there's very powerful medicine in that.
I love what you said too. I like how you reframe that. Yeah.
How can we, I mean, what are you doing? Is there a crossover with the LPLP project and you know, Black Lives Matter and that element?
Well, there is, to the extent that Standing Rock was fundamentally a crisis of over-policing and police abuse. Again, your listeners are probably aware that people were water cannoned in sub-freezing temperatures. People were shot with rubber bullets. A young woman from the East Coast had all the soft tissue on her forearm destroyed in some kind of explosion that occurred that was caused by the police department. I mean, there's a private military security company called Tiger Swan that was hired by the energy company there to essentially police, you know, and they had military equipment, and they used intelligence techniques, including they created entire like wire diagrams where they were effectively describing water protectors as similar to jihadist terrorists, you know, describing their psychology and trying to get, I mean, this is, you know, when you look at the fact that profit motivated military security companies are teaming up with oil companies who are building pipelines, like literally like just like a few yards from tribal nations, just to the north, so that the water, if it was contaminated, would just completely destroy the health and well-being of this community that's already been screwed over in so many ways it's impossible to even account for it. Like, when you have to look at it in context, right? So these big guns, big artillery being combined with private capital, you know, in the era of runaway climate change, where the entire, you know, global community is existentially threatened by our inability to say no to ourselves. Like, you have to frame it, like you have to understand it in context to become angry about it. And this is what happened. I mean, the whole world got furious about Standing Rock because we are paying attention to the big picture. We're paying attention to the context. You know, we're not saying to ourselves, oh, everybody needs oil. No, we're saying it's time to move away from oil.
Right.
And given that fact, it's extra egregious that you're going to bully this, you know, this Native American community that incidentally is one of the poorest places in the country, you know, during a time when there's money to go around. I mean, the United States has got money everywhere. We're awash in cash. It's being hoarded by the 1%, to leverage a term that I think that Bernie and others have propagated. Like we have a distribution problem. We don't have a wealth problem.
Right.
In this country.
Right.
Yeah.
And so do you think that like I've read some articles about the current protests and riots actually distracting us from the big issues at hand, and you know, just being environmental issues and the notion of government abuse of power. Do you think that there is a reframe that needs to happen with this movement? And do you think that also this movement, including the riots and the looting, is actually just giving ammo to the 1%ers to initiate kind of a lockdown process on the people?
What I've thought a fair amount about this, and you know, I think we have to be careful about allowing a handful of provocateurs and irresponsible parties to define a movement. And I think that, you know, any movement is responsible for self-regulating to some extent. And I think this movement has done as good a job at that as any. There was some rioting at the beginning, some looting at the beginning. I think for the most part, this protest activity has been safe, has been responsible. You know, probably 99.99% of all the people who have participated in a march in the past month have done so in a peaceable, responsible way. And so probably inevitably there's going to be some messiness every time you try to attack a problem that's this big. You know, I mean, I don't know how many people who are listening to this interview have really attended to the detail of how this gentleman was killed by police. He was begging for his life. Like, he was communicating to the police. There were 4 of them. He was trying to tell them that he was dying. He was saying, I'm going to die. I can't breathe. And at some point,
and the observers were saying the same thing.
And people were trying to get the cops to change their behavior. At some point, he was so delusional because he was out of oxygen, clearly. He was trying to talk to his mom, who was dead and clearly not there. And the cops knew that. Anyway, the incredible insensitivity of, I think he actually died. He had stopped, his pulse had stopped, and they had discerned that. They had checked his pulse and noticed that he didn't have a pulse 3 minutes before the cop took his knee off his neck. So in other words, he was without a pulse for 3 full minutes while this guy was continuing to kill him. I mean, after he'd already died, apparently. It's like, so all of that just, it creates a visceral response on the part of people.
Right.
You know, again, it's just like the Native American activism that I'm involved with. You have to look at it in context. Native American reservations in this country used to be prison camps where Native people could be killed if they were caught off the reservation. Most people actually came into the reservations not because they wanted to, but because they were starving to death. Why? Because they systematically annihilated the buffalo population in the Midwest and starved out these Native American people who were here before the Europeans, right? I mean, so all of that provides context for the fact that there's a meth problem in Lakota country, the fact that there's alcoholism in Native country. Like, you know, the same thing has to be looked at. You have to look at it in the same way with respect to the looting and different things that have gone on. Yes, you know, really oppressed and poor African-American people, you know, are going to do things like break windows or steal stuff when provided the opportunity. I think that probably some white people would do the same. So, I want to just mention also that I really respect the way that this movement has tried to self-regulate. You have seen people who are provocateurs being accosted by other protesters and disciplined, maybe even turned over to the police. Like, there's been a fair amount of that going on too, which I think helps to restore the credibility of the movement. No doubt every movement has a responsibility to look at itself. And I mean, obviously Dr. King and Mohandas Gandhi, these are examples of people who are absolutely impeccable at instilling discipline in the different you know, movements that they were a part of. Gandhi actually almost fasted himself to death because there was fighting going on between Indians and Pakistanis. He was trying to create a peaceable relationship between those two countries. And he was willing to die himself as a response to the fact that people started fighting amongst themselves. Like that kind of commitment obviously is incredibly powerful. And I think that we've had leaders who are doing, representing that kind of moral authority right now. The Black Lives Matter movement is a responsible organization. They care about, the big issues. They're not just reckless people. And so they have been trying to instigate discipline with respect to this movement as well. And I think they're doing a good enough job. That's my opinion.
Yeah. It's interesting to how to balance the rage that comes up with the injustice, with the sort of tempered humility of intellectually decided, aligned action. I know that as a passionate being, I find myself often in the sort of emotional rage section of injustice. Like for me, when I think of injustice, it is I want to like fight it. And of course, there's no template, but how do we balance those things? How do we balance the kind of the emotional side of wanting to fight the fight versus the MLK kind of Gandhi
violence?
Yeah.
I love having the opportunity to respond to that question because it gives me a chance to talk about the work that you and I did together. We produced a yoga festival because we recognize emotional discipline, the disciplining of the passions, as being essential to life. Right? Yoga. There are countless types of yoga. There's yoga of the intellect. There's yoga of action. Gandhi was a karma yogi, and that's yoga of action. He didn't spend a lot of time contemplating or sitting cross-legged. He actually was doing stuff, and that was his kind of active contemplative mode. Yoga is very liberal in this respect. It understands all the different modalities that we have as spiritual beings. But I mean, what runs through all strains of yoga is the understanding that you have to discipline desire. This is Buddhist as well. The Buddhists and the yogis, they understand that you can do anything under the sun as long as you do it from a lucid, philosophically grounded, spiritually rooted state of consciousness. It's going to be effective. It's going to constitute what the Buddhists refer to as right action. When you allow your passions to overwhelm you, I mean, you invoke emotion, and emotion is obviously important. I think in spiritual communities, there's this idea of holy rage, like that kind of, maybe that's what would describe Jesus when he whipped the money changers out of the temple or whatever. Like there are lots of examples where spiritual masters have allowed themselves to exhibit aggression. I guess what I would say is that the key is to always be working on achieving self-mastery so that you never lose control. You're disciplined in the way that you're acting, and you don't have too many rules, because I mean this is an important thing. I'm actually not a pacifist. I don't believe in dogmatic nonviolence. I think there are times when you have to be very aggressive. I think the taking of life is a very major, that's a line that you want to try absolutely to not cross whenever possible. But I think that sometimes you got to scream and yell. Like you got to do things to get people's attention because they're so locked into some mode of egotism that a soft tactic is not going to work with them. But what differentiates right action from wrong action is not doing so from a place of kind of being overwhelmed by passion. You want to be lucid in your mind and thoughtful. So that actually love is what's motivating that aggression if you're going to use it.
Nice. And so with regards to the future, what do you see as the best outcome with this situation, Black Lives Matter, and the situation with the Native American population, which I almost include in that same people of color, racist bigotry that happens in the States.
Yeah.
What do you see as what's the best outcome?
In both cases, in the case of Native American people and African American people, you have populations that were forcibly dispossessed. Right, with Native people, they were forced onto reservations. They were genocided. There are only a couple of million. There's only about 2% left of Native people as compared to where they were originally. African Americans.
What percentage of American population are?
It's very small, very small. I should know that off the top of my head. I'm not entirely sure, but it's not a large percentage. Much smaller than the African American population. I think it may be around. It's in the low single digits for the American population. African Americans, Black people constitute 13% of this country, and they, you know, as everyone knows, they were forcibly, you know, extracted from their homeland and pulled across an ocean, and then inflicted with servitude. They were never helped in the aftermath of that legal servitude. There's never been reparations. There's never been an effective process of training or providing, you know, resources. It's like, you know, so these two populations have a lot in common. They really do. And you ask about solutions, man. I mean, what I can say is that we're all in it together now. There's no question about that. You know, my colleague Chase is very awake to that fact. He's not trying to make white people leave or go home. That's not going to happen. He doesn't want it to happen. He wants us to understand what it means to live within a just structure together now. You know, and one thing I like to point out is that when white people arrived on this continent, they could have behaved differently. Right. The native folks actually took them in and tried to host them. How do you treat a host? There are lots of, what's that?
Saved them with the Thanksgiving, wasn't it?
That's right. That's right. My colleagues refer to that as thanks-taking, because effectively that's what it ended up becoming. So, like, there are ways to create justice now, and it doesn't necessitate going back and undoing the past. It requires facing the past, understanding what it meant, and then trying to make the repairs needed now. So, I mean, look, the obvious thing is there's got to be equality. There has to be equality in terms of access to education, access to capital, so that you can start businesses. If you have education, you have knowledge, you combine that with capital, you can be an entrepreneur. You can create, you know, wealth for yourself and your community. Like, these are the kinds of things that have to happen immediately. Like, I spent a lot of time on tribal nations where, like, you're lucky if you can get a sandwich. Like, that's how economically disadvantaged these people are. There are no stores. There are no banks. The health facilities are all operated by the federal government. There's no spontaneous provision of health services. There are no clinics. There's just, like, it's incredible. And it's not that different from certain African-American communities in this country, or for that matter, Hispanic communities. Let's not forget Hispanic people. Mexico possessed California until Zachary Taylor, an American president, decided that he was just going to take it. He just took California. You and I live in California, you know, and we act like somehow there's an invasion from the, we don't, you and I, but people act like there's an invasion from the South. Donald Trump acts like, you know, Mexicans coming across the border into California are somehow engaged in a criminal act. They're not engaged in a criminal act. They're effectively just coming home. Like, that needs to be understood, you know, and it's not to say that we don't need laws and stuff at this stage, but you always have to take the historical context into account. And the poverty that Hispanic people, Black people, Native American people experience in the United States, it didn't have to be. Right. There could have been a different way of the races relating to one another. And now we have to have equality, Mark. That's the key, equality. And the last thing I'll say on this topic is that the effective way to respond to the killing of this Black man just a couple of weeks ago is to look at police, yes. Look at law enforcement, yes. Look at reallocating funds to social programs, et cetera, instead of just funding law enforcement through the teeth, whatever. All that stuff has to be looked at. But what can't be ignored, what absolutely must not be ignored, are the big systemic causes of the poverty that then leads to this cycle of criminality, and then law enforcement doing what it does. You know, some police, I will throw a bone to some of them. Some of them are victims too. They're victims of a system that puts them in a position of having to police communities where criminality is inevitable. It's inevitable because there's so much pressure and violence going on within these communities that the perfectly rational thing to do is to act out. You know, and so cops also have to be supported, and law enforcement has to be reimagined so that it's not just adding fuel to a fire that's going on. Instead, we're looking at how to undo that fire.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's this patriarchal oppression versus I'm almost a matriarchal caring, kind of like oppression versus caring, like do this, or like, okay, what is it you need?
Absolutely right.
How does this connect to, I mean, I saw an interesting program on positive discrimination with things getting into, like, to get back to equality. What about reparation? Is that the right word?
Reparations?
Reparation. How does that look in this situation? Is it something that we can feasibly do? And how would we begin, both with the Native American communities and with the people of color?
It starts with taxation, Mark. The inequality that we have is in large part a function of the fact that since the 1980s, since Ronald Reagan, we have been taxing the wealthy people in this country less and less. And we've gotten ourselves into a position where, we still have social programs, not enough, but we still have them, and we have tax cuts for the rich, which what does that lead to? Inevitably leads to $25 trillion of debt. When Reagan came into office, we didn't have any debt. I think he added the first $3 trillion. But, and I'm going to be polemical here and say that Republican administrations have been basically, devastating our credit, so to speak. I'm not a huge fan of Bill Clinton, but he did balance the budget. We did have we had a surplus under him by the end of his term. Same with Obama. Obama inherited a total mess from George W. Bush, who elected to go to war with a country that did nothing to us, spent trillions of dollars killing people completely unnecessarily and ruining a country. Like, it's just amazing. The mess that exists in the Middle East is in large part because, W and Cheney and these guys felt the need to assert themselves. You mentioned patriarchy, and it's just completely crazy what they did. But it also jeopardized our country by putting us in an economic crisis that Obama then had to come in and fix, which he did do. Like, he did put us back on our feet. Now we've got another guy, Trump, who's completely, totally checked out. Like, the guy has no clue. He may be a businessman, but he doesn't have the first idea about how to manage an economy, how to balance budgets, how to confront a runaway debt that we have currently, $25 trillion. I started this train of thought by saying that it starts with taxation. There needs to be a rational tax structure where the most affluent people take Jeff Bezos. The guy owns Amazon. Amazon didn't pay any tax last year. They don't pay. What's that?
I don't understand how that can exist.
It's insane, man. Loopholes, all kinds of different ways that the affluent people, who incidentally rely upon the rest of us to do all of what we do so that they can make the money that they, quote, make.
Right.
It doesn't belong to them. It belongs to everyone who's participated in some way in the supply chain to create value, right? And I'm not saying that we all have to have exactly the same income. What I'm saying is that it is out of control, the inequality in this country. So you start by taxing. You start by, what's that?
Start with the money.
You start with the money. You create pools of money that are collectively controlled, and then you start to allocate them. Look, it's amazing the way that that greed works, and selfishness works. People, it's like the Nazis, brother. I mean, the Nazis were so out of control with their egotism that they destroyed themselves. Like, people do irrational things out of a desire to not share. It's like the banks in 2008. Like, they just went completely over a cliff. They were in such a frenzy of greed and possessiveness that they almost destroyed their own homes, their own reality. And the government stepped in to fix it. So right now we have some of that going on too. It's like, why, for example, do we not have healthcare for everyone, no questions asked? Why do we put, we have enough of a heart as a community to not have homeless people just die on the street. So they end up going to the emergency room, which ends up costing like 10 times for the community what it would cost to just make sure that everybody was insured, right? It's like these kinds of irrational things that we do, they need to be repaired. But it starts with taxing affluent people at a higher level, creating pots of money that can then be used, in rational ways to fix some of these social problems.
The bizarre thing to me is that it seems obvious to me that Trump, being the type of businessman that he is, and all the Republicans, and even I would include the Democrats, they seem to me to be the same uber rich 1%ers. I mean, Clintons and Bushes, they're all uber rich people. And it seems like they do these things to benefit them and their uber rich friends. So what's bizarre to me is how many people are supporting Trump who are on that breadline, who are poor, who are desperately poor. I don't compute how they don't get that the whole system is rigged. But then I ask myself, what about Hillary Clinton? I mean, I personally think she is evil incarnate. I think she's far worse for this country than Trump, because Trump at least stimulated through his open bigotry people like AOC going into Congress, and so many, the greatest amount of people of color in Congress now that has ever been. So I thank Trump for that. He didn't intend to do it, just through his bigotry. I suppose the question is there any solution with this two-party system? We've now got this cardboard box, Joe Biden versus Trump. I mean, I can't imagine that Joe Biden's going to do anything different. Are we just like circling through the same bullshit illusion?
You've raised a couple questions there, Mark. One is this question of whether the two parties are really differentiated adequately, and the other is why it is that poor people support conservative policy, right wing. On the first topic, I'll say I don't have the same view that you do about Hillary. I think she's got a very underdeveloped limbic system. I think she does not have an appealing personality, and that's the main reason why we all tend to think that she's not a good person. I mean, I think she's a moderate politician, much like her husband was. I think she has 1/10 the charisma that he did, and that doomed her. It's a failure. But I agree with you that there's not a radical difference between the Republican and Democratic parties. But I think there's enough of a difference that it makes sense to get in behind the Democrats and then push them. I mean, much as Bernie and AOC have done, they both identify as Democrats, even though they're also Democratic socialists. Like, I am a Democratic socialist. I believe that, we need a lot more equality in this country, and that AOC and Bernie are kind of on the right track. But I also think that they're on the right track by getting into the party and pushing. I'm just going to very quickly articulate my overall philosophy about kind of the left-right continuum and how this dialectic operates. To me, we need to be moving towards progressive solutions, utopian solutions. I don't mind actually acknowledging that I have a sympathy for enlightened anarchism. Enlightened anarchism is a scenario where people are so good, they're so well developed, they're so responsible, they're so community oriented that they don't need to actually have coercive power, instantiated in the form of some kind of government or police force to make people do things. There is no reason why we shouldn't be aspiring to that. We should all be trying to dig deep within ourselves and identify those kinds of resources, right? So, but it's also true that, most people are not anywhere close to being able to identify with a perspective like that. So you have to, I kind of hit recently upon the distinction between a politician and a statesperson. A politician compromises, but compromises for him or herself. Self-serving, that's what motivates them. Careerism, they want to be the center of attention. A statesperson also compromises, and in many ways looks a lot like a politician. But a statesperson is looking for that leading edge. They're looking for that where they can push the community, lead. That's what leadership is. It's pushing the community towards progressive solutions as fast as they're capable of tolerating. Like that's good leadership right there. And so that entails confronting right-wing ideologies and, bigotry and divisiveness, these things that we understand exist on the right. But it also recognizes that you have to pace yourself if you're going to be able to have people come along. If you get out too far ahead of them, that's another form of egotism. It's a form of being disconnected from your responsibility as a leader. So I have more sympathy than you do for moderate Democrats. I think Biden is a stuffed shirt as well. I find him very uninspiring. And I really wish that Bernie had won the primary. It's heartbreaking. But I also think that he's way better than Trump. Although I recognize what you mean. I mean, sometimes really bad experiences can catalyze really good experiences. So if we trade 4 years of Trump for 8 years of whoever else, that's an exchange that I'm willing to consider as possibly a positive.
Right.
Anyway, on the other topic that you raised, which I find very interesting, I actually had a good friend when I was at Harvard whose father is a very famous economist who teaches at Harvard. And he researched on this very question, and a variety of people have tried to figure out why it is that poor people vote against their own interests. Like, what's going on with that? I mean, there's lots that could be said about it, but I'll start by just mentioning that it happens all over the world. When you look at Iran, the right wing, the Ayatollah, supported by the folks who are in the rural areas, who have not gone to school, and they just don't understand. So, it's true everywhere. It's true that poor people who have not been exposed to culture, to education, to these different kind of liberalizing effects, these liberalizing influences within society, they tend to support conservative politicians. And, the kind of like obvious contradiction of supporting policies that divide and create inequality rather than spreading the wealth more equally, that contradiction, I don't know quite what to say about it, except that it seems to be somehow tethered to like a sympathy for inequality, or sympathy for the kind of divisiveness that conservative policies propagate, seems to be somehow tethered to a lack of education, to a lack of exposure. Somehow people who are not illuminated through self-development, also can't imagine being part of a community with other people. They have a tendency to view themselves as separate and apart, and to then latch on to kind of simple-minded solutions that don't actually yield good results. I don't, what do you think? I'm curious.
I like that, but isn't this the time with the internet that we can band together and reach out to these disenfranchised, uneducated people who are only hurting themselves by, going for the people who are going to fund the uber rich?
I think so.
Something that Romero is looking at doing, like an educational reach out.
It's a beautiful, beautiful thought. I totally agree with the thought, and I've actually been saying this out loud lately. The way to undermine, bigotry in Alabama, the way to undermine, fossil fuel zealotry in North Dakota, is to somehow get in, Mark, and to bring culture, to bring illumination. I mean, you and I produced a yoga festival. We understand the value of experiences. There's no question that rock and roll is a real threat to conservative ideology. It's a threat because it opens people's hearts. It creates, feelings that then become quite subversive with respect to these conservative ideologies. I mean, you and I could envision some of this stuff together maybe sometime, but somehow going into these zones and getting access to the kids, like starting to work with kids about what it means to be cool in a constructive way. Like, to be cool means to be nice, and not to be an angry, mean person who tries to divide one group of people against another. Like, getting in with music, getting in with like enlightened spirituality, getting in with education, philosophy, political science, these different spaces where the mind starts to open up. Brother, I really do think that that's probably the only way, right? The only way to get the Deep South and the Midwest to stop acting like a bunch of morons.
Right. And I think with the internet, we've got a good opportunity to that. I mean, maybe it's as simple as this, and just the last thought, but maybe it's as simple as this, finding local personalities. Maybe it's, every 150 to 500,000 people in a section, you have a local personality, and you promote like a radio, TV show that's online, that is run by a local, that populates education and discussion, like we're doing here with the locals, to educate and unfold people from the place they are, as opposed to someone like me or you being the sort of overarching of all. Right. It's like we need to go meet them where they are.
I think that's brilliant. I do.
Cool. Let's talk about that.
You're talking about media. You're talking about the importance of media. Absolutely critical. No question. Thank you for doing this. You're producing media.
Well, yeah, but, as I said, media from a white guy talking to, as it happens here, another white guy, is, there's only so much that it can do and reach. And
of course.
People who can listen to this are already closer. That they're like, there's like a zone of proximal growth, the zone of proximal development, that they can hear this. Those deep south, what I would call morons, who are promoting something that only is going to hurt them and their family for future generations. They need to be met by people who are closer to their social, economic, and cultural identity. So
you're absolutely right.
Oh, I relate to this person. Oh, that's
absolutely correct.
expansion of my thoughts, just a little bit at a time, as you quite rightly said.
It takes us back to the beginning of this discussion about trust. If you don't have the trust of someone, they are not going to work with you. They're not going to listen to you, etc. Yeah.
Wonderful. Daniel Nelson, thank you so much for coming on and sharing all your excellent work.
Pleasure, Mark.
People can find out Romero Institute, LakotaLaw.org as well.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot on social media. You can find Danny and reach out if you want to contribute and get involved in the organization. Thanks again, Danny, for coming on.
Love you, brother. That was fun.
Love you. I'm just going to close out the show.
Okay.
Hang there, but I'll take you off the camera.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow, what a great show. I mean, these talks of what do we do with this injustice is a difficult scenario, especially coming from the places of privilege. How do we use our education and our privilege and our insight to help transform the system? And it seems like we need to empower the people in the systems in each point, almost like beacon points, to empower them to help their own communities.
Yep.
So rather than us taking the front line and standing up, oh, look at me, I'm fighting for justice, aren't I great? That's all very good, but it's a bit like charity.
I agree.
Charity, you're off camera at the moment, Danny, but they can't hit. If you give to charity and you demand that your name gets put at the top of the list, let everyone know I'm giving. It's like, what's really happening? I remember my father, giving to charity, and he always tell me he would give anonymously to charity. And I would always ask him why. Why don't you people to thank you and to say thank you? Like, look, I'm not doing it for me. Doing it for the people I'm giving to, and that relates to what Danny was saying about how being prepared to be the smallest person in the room, even though you might have considerable power intellectually, financially, educationally, emotionally, it doesn't matter. But being willing to be the smallest person in the room shows a humility which was which was embodied by the greatest of our leaders, by the people we continuously refer to, the Gandhis, the MLKs, the people who led through example of humility. And it seems like that's the way forward. So meeting people where they are, and enabling a moment of growth, growing from their place to the next level of evolutionary consciousness, and giving you ability to walk away, to be humble with it. Oh, wow. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been great. We have, thank you again to my guest, Daniel Nelson. You can find out more at LakotaLaw.org and RomeroInstitute.org. Next week we have I have a book, Book Evolve, bookevolve.com. You can find it now, bookevolve.com. There's a lot of integrated levels of how we can expand who we are. And please like, share. Hopefully there's shares. No, there they are. The share button. Until then, it's been such a pleasure. Markabadi signing out. Thank you so much.